My name's Gary Pender, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Heriot-Watt University in the first assembly of the FCERM.net, Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management.net, and it's my pleasure to be, organising today's meeting. So I think the next slide says welcome, which I've already done. So, welcome to Heriot-Watt again. A number of objectives associated with the particular meeting we're having today. The first one is to sort of update you on current research activities that are taking place in flood and coastal erosion risk management. And the second one is to sort of start the initial development of future research projects. So I'll talk a little bit more about how we plan to achieve these in the next slides. There's so much work going on just now across the whole flood risk management community and research activities at the minute that it was just impossible to try to fit it in with the standard, 20-minute presentations. We'd have had to be very selective in trying to identify people who could speak to cover that. So we've tried to go for a slightly different format for this meeting than we've done in the past. We've got some keynote speakers that we think will bring, pretty high-level, interesting messages for us to debate and discuss. And we've also then gone for these elevator pitches with the short presentations backed up by posters to give people the opportunity to talk and discuss and debate the research that's taking place. So hopefully by adopting that format, we'll get a broader coverage of everything that's taking place in the UK just now and flood and coastal erosion risk management research. The second objective about trying to develop ideas for new projects, we're going to start off by being informed by the research needs of the users of that, university research and research in general. So the Environment Agency, SEPA, and the Centre for Research Expertise in Waters are going to give us presentations on their perception of what the research needs are as far as they're concerned in trying to manage and change flood risk in the UK. We're then going to discuss these and debate these in breakout sessions to try and develop ideas and understanding as how some of these challenges could be addressed. We're going to do some networking activities to get to know each other, get to understand each other's expertise and how we might be able to collaborate. And we're going to involve feedback sessions where we feedback to this group in general. And again, everybody will get a chance to comment on what the groups have been talking about. So hopefully through that sort of process, we'll start to develop smaller networks of people who believe they can work together and will be able to develop research projects in the months ahead. So I don't anticipate that we'll be leaving here with a final project that we'll be able to submit anywhere, but it's the start of that process and a lot of work will need to go on after that. I would say, of course, that it's your time, actually, so it's up to you to use it as you see fit. We've tried to put together a structure that will help, but if you'd rather go away with another group and go and sit in the garden because it's a sunny day and talk about things, that's absolutely fine. As long as you talk about flood and coastal erosion risk management, I don't particularly care. As I say, the structure is flexible. We've never tried to manage it in this way before, and if people want to change it, adapt it to suit their needs best, that's perfectly fine. All we want is for you to leave here tomorrow feeling it's been a useful experience coming here, you've learned some stuff, and you've had value from the meeting. To add a little bit of context to the idea of projects and what these need to look like now, we've clearly got sort of user needs, priorities, ideas, research interests feeding into these things. The key idea behind the network is that we'll try and create this community that involves universities, policy makers, people who do flood risk management in practice. So that we want the network to include all of these different people that are involved in flood and coastal erosion risk management. Of course, we need an injection of funding into this to make the projects happen. We're not going to be specific about that. Different projects may look for different funders. So there's multiple opportunities for funding. We might have to think of combinations of funding to realise a project. So I think once the projects start to take shape and we understand what the objectives of the project are in a bit more detail, we can perhaps think about how these are resourced. Of course, what the project delivers is understanding. For a long time now, the sort of landscape has been changing. Academic research is still definitely about producing papers and high-quality scientific outputs. All of us who work in universities are, if not quite controlled by the Research Excellence Framework, certainly motivated by it to produce high-quality research and good quality papers. But that's not mutually exclusive with developing other things like tools, techniques, models, methods that people can use in practice. And in fact, there's a lot of drivers pushing us in the direction to do that. You know, government, the research councils and other organisations are now talking about impact of our research, the transformational nature of our research and the disruptive nature of our research. And I think it's interesting that the language has changed from impact, transformational, disruptive. It's getting kind of stronger words as time passes, and that we're really looking for universities to do things that change what people do in practice and benefit the community. And I don't think there's any sort of escaping from that. So that's one of the key things behind these projects, that we're trying to identify things where we can all work together as a group to achieve both high-quality scientific outputs and you know, useful stuff that people can use in practice to change the way in which flood and coastal erosion risk management is managed, not just in the UK, but internationally. That's all I wanted to say at the minute by way of an introduction and welcome. My next duty is to introduce our first keynote speaker, who is Edmund Penning-Rowsell. Edmund is a professor at the Flood Hazard Research Centre. He's a geographer by background. He got his PhD from University College London. As many of you know, his research interests are in the political economy of major hazards and how this affects decisions about investment in hazard mitigation. He's more than 40 years' experience of research and teaching in the flood hazard field, and in 2006 he was awarded an OBE by the Queen for his services to flood risk. So clearly a very eminent person to be kicking off our network meeting here today. So welcome, Edmund.
Thank you, Gary. And it's a great pleasure to be here in Edinburgh, Heriot-Watt University, and a privilege to talk to you today. I want to talk about an idea. And the idea is that we develop a reality approach to flood risk management research. That is to say, we move away a little from a normative approach, where we say what we believe should be done in flood risk management, away to a more real-based assessment of what can be done and what is the context of those decisions. And of course, as usual, I turn to Wikipedia to find out what I mean by reality, and there are some words here which are quite important to me, like fact and reality. Moving away from idealism and utopianism, and moving towards a situation where anything that is not real or anything that is artificial is not to be encouraged. This is quite a new idea for me, but I've been mulling it over after several years of research. So what I want to do today is to introduce you to that concept, very briefly, in relation to several aspects of flood risk management and flood risk management research, and then go on to look at risk assessment, which I've been writing about recently, and the reality of risk assessment. So realism number one concerns flood warnings. And the reality is that there are many alerts and warnings, but research continues to show that people at risk continue to consider they are not warned, or not warned well enough, or even warned at all. So the reality of flood warnings for many people is that they don't understand them and they don't receive them. Well, they don't receive them and they don't understand them. There are reasons for this, which I won't go into, but are gone into a paper that I produced or my colleagues published in Environmental Hazards, looking at the damage that is not reduced by warnings. So a reality check. The second reality area is flood insurance, which again I've been doing some work on over the years. And the reality there is that flood insurance is widely available, internationally unique actually in the UK. But the reality is that the poor have far less cover, we know about that. What is less clear is that the main beneficiaries of flood defence expenditure are the shareholders of insurance companies who continue to charge the same premium for those who are protected and those who are not protected, broadly speaking. Not exactly so, but pretty generally so. And therefore, any money that DEFRA spends on flood risk management flows directly to those who mainly benefit by continuing to charge the same premiums as they did hitherto. That's the reality of flood insurance in the UK. And there's a paper there which explains that, which you can follow up if you wish. Reality number 3 concerns flood victims. I rather like this slide, and I show it a lot. She really is suffering as a victim. He's less suffering because his Mini is insured against flood, and the new one, I think, is due to be delivered the following week. But victim pressure has its problems, as we saw in Somerset this last winter, where certain campaigns were mounted to discredit what the Environment Agency was doing, quite scandalously so in my view, claiming staggering incompetence by a bunch of people who knew nothing about the subject on which they were writing. So victim pressure and the political process that then ensues is a problem. And science, as I think we recognize, was the first victim of the flood situation in Somerset last winter. Science was pushed on one side in favor of an emotional response driven by the media and various interests behind those campaigns. That is the reality that we have to face. I don't think we can escape that, but we can try and change it. And there's a paper I wrote with Tim Harris, who's here, on the issue of victim pressure and the way that it could possibly distort sensible thinking and decision-making. Reality number 4, and this is the penultimate one, concerns spatial planning and flood risk management. And here the reality is that in a small island, which is crowded, there'll always be development in areas of flood risk. And we shouldn't necessarily wring our hands about that, but what we should do is to make sure that it's protected. Nobody would debate that development should not be allowed in the city of Westminster, for example, right in the floodplain, because it's protected to a very high standard. So if we have development in the floodplain, it needs to be properly understood. And that reality needs to be foregrounded rather than crowded out by people making nonsensible comments about development in flood risk areas. And there's another paper, which you can read again if you wish, about how decisions are made on appeal about flood risk management situations. So that's my reality idea, which we can debate. And the 5th form of reality is the work I've been doing on flood risk assessment, looking at the national assessment of flood risk in England and Wales. And this presentation was first given at the Rotterdam conference in 2012. Since when it's been published, it's been through the peer review process, thanks to people like Paul Bates. It's been forensically reviewed and was published online on the 20th of March. And the question I'm asking here is, why is national economic assessment of flood risk important? Well, it's important because it affects the whole discourse about flood risk management and the debate about how serious that problem is and how it might be exacerbated by development and by climate change. That whole debate is affected by the numbers that come out of a national flood risk assessment. It therefore indirectly affects policy. You can't draw a hard and fast line between one number and policy, but it affects the direction of travel, I believe, in the policy domain, and the urgency with which government approaches this at a political level. It can affect capital allocations, not at a scheme-by-scheme level, I should add, because those are done by Treasury Green Book rules. But it affects the general allocation process. And we know that because senior civil servants at DEFRA tell us that. So this presentation is Rotterdam Plus. And a lot of people have said, in relation to national flood risk assessment in the UK, or England and Wales rather, that the figure is something like £1 billion annually. And I'm just highlighting some of the pretty prestigious organizations that have said that. And the numbers have generally risen over time. So the latest number from the climate change risk assessment work shows, in their view, a figure for annual average damage, or expected annual damage, if you want to use that terminology, of £1.3 billion. 1.3 billion. Keep that figure in your head. And this kind of analysis and result has been transformed into a very high-level Cabinet Office document called the National Risk Register, which sets out the risks to this country, and coastal flooding is one from the top as a result of that. Inland flooding just below that. And this was done on the basis of figures such as I've just described. An update on that in 2013 provides a bit more information. Again, coastal flooding is one from the top, and fluvial flooding, inland flooding is one below that, or two below that. And the metric suggests that possibly 1 in 20 such events could occur in the next 5 years. 1 in 20 in the next 5 years. So maybe 1 in 100 years is the return period being suggested for coastal flooding. And with the exception of some flooding caused by the storm surges in this last winter and the flooding in Tarin, we have not had a major coastal flood of any significance since 1953, more than 50 years ago. So you begin to wonder about that kind of analysis. Okay. So where does this number come from, of £1 billion? It comes from a decade or more of research undertaken at HR Wallingford with the help of others, including Halcrows, starting off with something called the NAR project in 2000, National Assets at Risk project, which came out with a figure of 0.626 billion. And over time, that work was redone with many different assumptions, quite rightly so, many different data sets being improved all the time, until we came to a situation in 2008 when the result was £5.136 billion of annual average damage. That was the preliminary result, which was corrected in the same year and brought down to 1.281 billion. And it was done by changing the damage data that went into the assessment. But throughout this decade or so of research, there's been no systematic verification of calibration of these results. Some people say it's not possible, but none appears to have been attempted. Here's the data set, and ending up with an average of about £1 billion. And there's the 2008 result, which used a new flood spreading model to spread the floodwater onto the floodplain, thereby causing damage. And that result was modified by using what's called the weighted annual average damage figures from the Middlesex University multicolored manual, and brought down to a much lower figure because the WAAD figure only goes to 1.2 meters of flooding, as opposed to 3 meters of flooding for the depth damage curves. And hence if you like, the damage was capped. And the result was conveniently much lower. So my conclusion number one from this is that the model appears to be unstable and unreliable. That's a bit provocative, but that's my conclusion. I then began to look at particular locations where annual average damage was considered to be quite high. And I could only find one map of the result, and that's in the Foresight report in 2004, and this is the expected annual economic damage mapped across the whole of the country. And just by chance, I focused on one particular area where there were 4 contiguous squares with damage values of £2.5 million per year. £2.5 million per year. And this was the Blackpool area. And I thought, gosh, that's an awful lot of damage. And I'd been to Blackpool, and I'd seen the defences there, and seen that they were pretty strong. Now, there is an area to the north of Blackpool, at Cleverley, where there is quite a lot of potential flooding, as you can see from the Environment Agency's map. So I looked at that as well. But I also found that defences there were being replaced and actually had been quite strong before. There's the map of Cleverley. You can see the flood extent, but it's mostly flooding above a 100-year return period, hence the turquoisey, bluey, greeny colour. And therefore, the contribution that will make to annual average damage is really quite small, disastrous though the flood would be. And again, we find significant flood defences. So how can there be 10 millions of annual average damage along this coast in those 4 contiguous squares, I thought to myself. I'm not sure that I really have confidence in that. And if you look at Blackpool itself, which is part of those 4 contiguous squares, I believe, and I look at the topographic map and I find that most of Blackpool is actually quite high, 24 metres, 23 metres, okay, 9 metres and 14 metres, way above any surge level that might be flooding this area if the defences were breached. So I wasn't very happy with that. The second piece of evidence that I looked at was a report done by the IBM Corporation in 2006, which developed what's called a profile, risk profile for the country. This is in the document provided to DEFRA, not publicly available. And you can see that they've mapped certain events against this profile, the 53 event and the Easter 1998 event, and what they call typical damages. And they came to the conclusion that the annual figure, the mean figure there, is about £500 million. Okay, so that's an interesting result. And they did this on the basis of no change in the flood defence infrastructure since 1953. So you could say quite a lot of money has been spent in the last 50 years on flood defence. So that's not really very realistic, and surely the figure must be lower than that. They concluded in 2006 that the NAFRA model overstates the exposure of the UK economy to flood losses. That's their conclusion. Moreover, they said that this conclusion is supported by the views of the relevant experts within DEFRA and the Environment Agency, who noted that NAFRA predictions seem high. It's a quote from their document. So I came to the conclusion, number 2, that RASP, which is the engine behind NAFRA, predictions look badly exaggerated. Okay, so I began to think about that. Again, I'm trying to get a reality approach to this area of flood risk management research. So I then began to look at the extremes, as you would. And I updated the 1947 damages, and it came to £0.47 billion. Now, that updating is a bit tricky, because a flood today would flood more properties, and I'm not sure that the inflation updating is quite right, and Terry Marsh at CEH was a bit sceptical about that. So let's leave that on one side. 53 was very serious, 2007 was very serious, 2000 was less serious, and that 2000 figure was pretty comprehensively researched. So maybe there are 3, maybe there are only 2 events above £3 billion in that timescale. If you go back beyond 1947, you get 1894 on the Thames, not much major flooding in between, not the kind of flooding that would generate these numbers. So I asked myself the reality check, how can the annual average damage be $1 billion if there have been only 2, maybe 3 floods since 1894 with losses greater than that value? Even my maths tells me that that's unlikely. I then began to look at any other data I could get on damage caused by flooding. And of course, I turned to the insurance record. And since 1998, the insurance industry has separated out what we would know as flooding from other water events, such as burst water pipes, and they give a set of data giving the results of the insured losses. Now, I know that not everybody's insured, and I know also that the ABI doesn't cover the whole market, so we have to qualify in that respect. But I also know that these figures are financial figures. They're damage to households, and you have to correct downwards very considerably to get the economic figures. You have to halve them roughly. And also you have to deduct the VAT, which I recently discovered is on all claims figures, as you would expect. And we come up with a figure on average, and this is residential only, no it's not, so it's the whole lot, of 0.272 billion pounds. So I'm thinking, wow, this is different from £1 billion. And we've had to increase the raw average, which is not shown there, of 0.226 billion. I've uprated it by 20% to allow for underinsurance and lack of penetration into the marketplace. But we have these relatively low figures from the insurance industry. You can have a big error band around them if you like, but they are way, way, way down on that figure of £1 billion. I then looked at the Environment Agency's record of properties that have flooded. And there is a fairly good record of that, produced by Oliver Harmer, and it gave you those figures there. And if you multiply that by the average insurance claim reported by the insurance industry of about £30,000, you get a figure about 0.261 billion pounds of insured losses. Again, a lot lower than £1 billion. And people said to me, yes, but what you're missing is the really, really extreme events. They could be adding considerably to AAD above the figure that you've got. Okay? And luckily, I had information from the T2100 project. And they exhaustively looked at damage potential using RASP-type technology undertaken by H.R. Wallingford, and they came up with a figure of 0.07 billion pounds. Why is it so low? Because the design standard of the Thames Barrier is at least 1,000 years and probably more like 5,000 years. So it takes a huge event to create any damage at all. And when you take the damage of a huge event and annualize it, you get quite a small sum. That's not to say we shouldn't be worried about huge events. I am. But I'm also worried about the annual average. If you take the NAFRA average for the same area, it comes out at over 0.6 billion pounds for the Thames area plus the bits of the T2100 area outside the Thames region. If you take one away from the other, you get a figure of 0.59 billion, which would be the figures outside the London area, contributing to that £1 billion worth of AAD. And I thought this is simply not credible. There are no significant places in the Thames area which would generate anything like that, whether it's Oxford or Marlow or Guildford or wherever, where there is flood damage potential. There's just nowhere that could get anywhere near that sum. So something must be wrong, and I believe something is wrong is the billion figure that we're starting with. I then did something different, which is actually not in the Rotterdam paper, but is in the transactions paper, and looked again at the weighted annual average damage analysis. Now, weighted annual average damage is a fairly arcane statistic developed by John Chatterton in the 80s. And I can only describe it as the average damage caused to the average property in the average floodplain affected by the average flood. So it's the average of an average, an average, and an average. It's like a sort of typical house in a typical floodplain that's flooded by a typical flood. And it weights it according to the likelihood of each typical flood. So I asked myself, what kind of event damages do we need to get to an AAD of £1 billion? This is reversing the WAAD process, which is usually used to calculate AAD for a scheme or an idea, reversing it to say, we have an AAD of £1 billion, what event damages do we need to get to that figure? Now, you have to allow for the fact that WAAD figures are differentiated by the standard of protection of the area affected. And I said to myself, well, surely the country at least has a 10-year standard of protection everywhere. Everywhere. So on average, it doesn't flood everywhere until you have a 10-year flood. And that's the SOP of 2010 there. And I get the kind of event figures on the left-hand side. I get event figures of 6 billion, 5 billion, 4 billion. And I thought, they're very high. And I think, well, perhaps we have a higher standard of protection for the country as a whole of 25 years, bearing in mind that the Thames Barrier's got a design standard of 1,000 years, and that protects a huge number of properties across the country. So the average must be quite high. And if the average is 25 years, then you need event figures of something like 14 or 15 billion economic losses, not financial losses, in order to generate that sum. And the horizontal red line is the figure for the losses in residential properties in 2007, one of the most serious floods we've ever experienced in this country. So something's wrong again here, and something wrong is the billion-pound figure we're starting with. So to summarize some of this analysis, there's the figure in the latest Environment Agency analysis of NAFRA 2008, and it's the same sort of figures reported in the climate change risk assessment documentation. And here are the kind of figures that I've been getting. And here is the average of what I've been getting. National economic losses of something like 0.25, maybe 0.26, and there's a little correction there, which is contained in the circulation paper, to one of the data points, which makes very little difference. Or if you include the IBM analysis, which I'm a bit reluctant to do, you get a figure of 0.3 billion. Now, a lot of people have argued against this. There are some important arguments. I mean, at breakfast today, Brian Goulding will say, well, the thing is that NAFRA doesn't include everything. Well, it doesn't include the intangibles elements. It doesn't include surface water flooding, although the insurance data does. And it doesn't include climate change. Well, no, it doesn't, because we're looking at current AAD. AAD today, not projecting on into the future, which might be completely different and much, much higher. I don't know. Foresight said it would be. Current floods are likely to be more damaging than floods in the past. Well, that's absolutely right. But there has been huge investment since the past, since 1953. On average, at today's prices, probably £300 million a year every year. Surely that would have drawn down flood losses so that current AAD was not the same as it would have been in 1953 or 1947. You're missing intangibles. Yes, we are missing intangibles. So does NAFRA miss the intangibles. So I'm trying to compare like with like in a reality check on this national figure. I've ignored surface water flooding. Yes, I have ignored surface water flooding because so does NAFRA. The insurance company data does include national. So if you get the insurance figure of 0.2 something billion, that includes surface water flooding. To get the NAFRA equivalent figure, you'd have to come down again, even less. And a very important point here, even a long record misses extremes that could add significantly to AAD, and this is one of the difficult things to unravel here. But I've been back to 1894. That's quite a long record. And there's a piece of research done in Germany which is perhaps not quite comparable, and maybe I've taken it slightly out of context, that the extreme events above 100 can usually contribute really very small amounts to AAD because you're dividing numbers by 100 and 500, even more so. Floods that are unlikely to show up in a 50 or 100-year record, which is what we've got here, will never add hugely to AAD. I believe that to be correct. So conclusion number 4 is that counter-arguments are at best weak and at worst misinformed. Now, I've been updating this analysis a bit, and some of that is in the circulation paper, which you can pursue, and the areas in the red box there are the new sets of data. And I thought to myself, well, maybe the events of 2014 and 2013 and 2012 will have added significantly to my calculated AAD. This is for residential only. And the backward-looking arrow towards me gives the average that I had before of about 1.147 billion economic losses. This is from the insurance data. And lo and behold, if I add the next 4 years, 2011, 2012, 13, 14, half of 14, I get almost exactly the same figure. That's the long-run average. Why? Because almost no flooding occurred in 2011, and we are trying to get a long-term average. So that doesn't change my perspective at all on this. There is a caveat there, which I don't mention actually in the paper, and I should come clean about this because I've only just learnt it, is that the ABI doesn't hold all the market. Not every insurance company is a member of the ABI. Only about 82% of the market is covered. And all the figures I've given you today from the insurance industry need to be modified very slightly because of that factor. They don't change the order of magnitude, they change the last couple of decimal places. Now, another analysis was done for me by Paul Samuels, who's, I think, quite a good mathematician. And he plotted out the damage values, and this is Greek to me. He plotted out the damage values on this kind of log-log relationship. It comes out with another nice straight line. And he writes to me, I show you this very informally, I've played with the data and suppose 2007 will be the highest damage value. There we are. If we have 50 years of record, assuming my use of the gamma function, and whatever he means by that, I just don't know, is correct, need to check this, then this changes EAD to 144 million or 0.144 billion, to give you an idea of the importance of this particular event in the bigger picture. So he gets a figure, this is residential only, of 1.144 billion. Now, if you try and uprate that for the total exposure, you have to multiply by a factor which is the ratio of residential losses to the total losses. And we have those figures for the 2000 flood, fairly well established, 2007, well established, and now 2013 from the insurance industry itself. And the weighted mean is 41.8%. So 41.8% of all losses are from the residential sector. So you uprate the 0.144 billion figure by that figure, and you get a figure for total AAD of 0.34 billion. Higher than the previous figures I've given you, but not, as it were, not a million miles away. That's the figures I had previously. So this is, again, sort of confirmation that I'm not far away from what another type of analysis would give you, and you're still a long way away from £1 billion of AAD. So conclusion number 4B is that uprating for 2013-14 floods, correcting one small error that I mentioned in the circulation paper, and a change the residential NRP ratio does not change the results to any marked extent. Well, it adds quite a bit, but it doesn't take it out of court, as it were. So a realist approach to the extent of flood risk is what I'm trying to get to. I'm not trying to be antagonistic to the agency at all. I have great faith in the agency and admire what it's doing. I just want to make sure that they get things right. The model appears to be unstable and unpredictable. Some RASP-NAFRA predictions seem badly exaggerated. The likely AAD is something like 0.26 to 0.3, not 1.0 to 1.3 billion. Counter-arguments are at best weak and at worst misinformed. Updating does not change the results to any marked extent, maybe to 0.34 billion. Conclusion number 5, I believe there's an exaggeration there that's become embedded, and that's regrettable. And I don't think we should be allowing this to continue. We need to be more realistic about the risks that we face. So I've described in detail here a reality approach to assessing risk, but please don't forget the words that I've used to describe that reality, and also the other policy areas that I think also deserve attention and a reality approach. Thank you very much. Now, Colin Thorne's going to come and tease some questions out of you.
We have in the programme around 20 minutes allocated for a Q&A session, and the organisers asked me to chair that, which I'm happy to do. And I'm also advised that if we do need longer, then we should take it. So if we run out of questions, we'll stop, and if things are bubbling along nicely, then we'll see where that leads us. What I'd like to do before I invite questions is just make a couple of overarching comments and say that I think what we're talking about this morning is essentially challenge, peer review and scrutiny, which are absolute meat and potatoes to academics, and I would argue should be to research practitioners as well. And what we've seen here is quite a forensic example of that, a process that I think is entirely healthy and important, but on the other hand, which can be misunderstood by people who are not academics and professional practitioners. And so we have to be a little bit careful about filtering our discussions for wider audiences who just frankly won't get it. So the other thing I'd like to do is not let us get hung up on any particular aspect of Edmund's treatise, and particularly perhaps not focus too much on a number, because that number, the one thing we know about it is it's wrong, because there's a large uncertainty band here, and so we have to be talking about ranges and probability distributions of numbers. But just to stimulate the conversation, let's remember why this is important, because this is an iconic number. But on the other hand, we have to say, well, is it fit to purpose? Is it really the right parameter for what we're trying to do with it? What is its utility? How is it calculated? How objective is that? What's the science base? What are the uncertainties? And we've heard about some of them, but I'd argue there are quite a few other ones, and let's be careful about not confusing accuracy and precision. And then the other thing is, if we are going to try and deal with these uncertainties, what we'll discover is that if we try and quantify them using conventional uncertainty analysis, we'll disappear up our own tailpipes. It can't be done. We have to think of the relevant dominant uncertainties and look for tipping points and look for thresholds where that uncertainty is going to change a decision that's made on the basis of the number, because that's the only uncertainty that matters. So the science challenges, I think, are clear. We've heard a historical account of some of the attempts to deal with them, imperfect as they are, imperfect as they always will be. Let's see if we can structure a discussion and try and get all of the voices heard. So let's start with Andrew Mullers. Yeah, wait for the mic. And perhaps, again, I should say, as usual in these affairs, perhaps declare who you are and what your affiliation is, so we know who everybody is.
Yes, thanks, Colin. Andy Moores from the Environment Agency. Thanks, Edmund. Challenging, as always. Just wanted to make, first of all, a couple of points, and one, I guess, challenge back to you, Edmund, directly, and then probably a couple that are more appropriate for the room, not necessarily wanting to get an answer now, but perhaps seeding some of the workshop discussions later. First off, I think Colin's already mentioned it. From an agency perspective, we are aware of some of the uncertainties in the data, and I think one of the challenges is communicating that. You mentioned in the context of Somerset some of the difficulties with the communicating to the non-expert audience, so there's a challenge around that. I'm also pleased that you mentioned that local scheme appraisal is not subject to, it's done differently to the NAFRA results in terms of Treasury Green Book rules, etc. The other point I wanted to make was we are actually scoping a replacement to NAFRA at the moment, and actually we're really wanting the science community to feed into that. We're starting with a sort of blank sheet of paper with that. One of the questions I had for you, Edmund, is you mentioned, I think it was in the German study, about big events contributing little to annual average damages, but then the quotes that you gave from the 47, the 53, the 2000, 2007 floods were all the big events. So I'm just wondering what the aggregation of other small events actually looks like, given that the German conclusions were that the 1 in 100-year event doesn't alter the annual average damages that much. So that's the challenge, I guess, on the data that you provided. The other thing, two things for the room. How do we reconcile the lack or the apparent lack of significant annual average damages in the historic record with recent results that have come from the joint programme in terms of the risk of widespread flooding? So we've got results, spatial coherence work that's recently been published, which considers the 2007 event to be, roughly speaking, if you look at it as an event which happens where you've got a 100-year flow in 3 regions within the same week, as happening 1 in every 7 years, which is very different metrics, but challenges, I think, some of the assumptions in there. So that's probably a question to the room, I think, the spatial one, but I think the one to you, Edmund, is the one on how the little events aggregate up to alter the figures given the German conclusions.
Well, the little events contribute by far the bulk of the AAD figure. I can't give you a figure for how much the 2007 event contributes to current AAD. I could work it out. But, I mean, our experience from scheme appraisal, which is a bit different from this, is that if you don't have losses in the 10, 15, 20, 30, 40-year return period events, then you're struggling to get an AAD, which in scheme terms gives you a good benefit-cost ratio. It's those middle-order events that give you the bulk of the AAD contribution. Okay, I quote the 3 big events because I ask a different question. How can the AAD be anything near those values if we've only had 3 of them in 100 years? That's a slightly different question. But I agree with you that the bulk of the AAD comes from the small events. Are we having more small events than we used to have? Well, I think we are. I don't dispute that. The figures from 98 to 2014 show a pretty flood-rich period. If you go back to the 60s and the 50s, okay, we had 53 and we had Linton and Lynmouth in 52. Yes, they were serious events, causing quite a lot of damage. When I started the Flood Hazard Research Centre in 1970, we did an awful lot of work in blazing sunshine, and people said, floods? What are you interested in floods? Surely you ought to be in droughts should be what you're studying. There was a pretty flood-lean period in the 70s. So it does seem to have a wave. I don't know. We had a flood-rich period now. But the calculations that I've given you are for that flood-rich period. They're not allowing for a flood-barren period in the 50s and 60s. If they were, you'd have figures much lower. But you're right to challenge the science community, say, okay, we need to improve these figures, and that's the base. That's the whole point of science.
Alan?
Alan Werrity, University of Dundee. A comment and a question, Edmund. The comment is that the figures you've just presented appear to me to be significantly lower than SEPA's current estimates of annual average damages for the whole of Scotland. I don't have those figures precisely to hand, but if I remember, they are somewhat larger than the values you're currently reporting. So I think there is another wider issue here that needs to be investigated, but that's the comment. The question, I think, goes back to your earlier slides, and you made some very interesting observations about injecting realism into a whole series of arenas in which we are undertaking flood risk management research. In terms of spatial planning, what would be your commentary on how we can explore that measure for managing flood risk in a more realistic way?
So the question, I think, was, what's my take on spatial planning? Is that the question, Alan? Well, the popular analysis of spatial planning and flood risk management is that there should be no development in floodplains, or pretty well no development. That's absolutely crazy. It depends on a balance of pros and cons. And again, I gave the extreme example of Westminster. You wouldn't think it's sensible for the government not to build new offices in Westminster. It's quite sensible to build on parts of the floodplain in Oxford, where I live, as long as it's protected to a reasonably good standard and you have contingency planning. If you look at maps of many counties around the country, I don't know about Scotland, they're very, very short of development land. It could be an AOMB or a national park or a conservation area or some other designation which makes it difficult to build properties. Floodplains are good places to live as long as you understand the risks and you're protected to a reasonable standard and you have contingency plans. Or you have elevated property. I know that takes away storage, but the popular myth is that we should sterilize our floodplains. That's crazy. So my view is that the realist approach is to look for areas where you can sensibly develop, sensibly protect, and understand the consequences.
I'll use my chair's prerogative just to come back on that. I read an article the other day talking about sacrificing farmland for flood risk and saying, there should be compensation and we do it. Well, this was actually in the Select Committee report that came out on Monday. And it said we're sacrificing farmland to flood management. Actually, I think we're sacrificing flood management land to farming is what we're doing. It was floodplain before it was farmed, and farming is entirely a social construct. So I'd agree with you. I think floodplains are really good places to live as well, 90% of the time, 99% of the time. They have to be protected, but that means compensating that loss of floodplain function in other places. And that means, as Sir David King said, hard choices. Because the floodwater's got to go somewhere. You can't keep it all in the channel. Brian, you were.
Thank you. Brian Golding from the Met Office. Just a brief comment on that last one. Of course, you have to not only protect the new housing, you also have to raise the protection of the downstream properties. Mm-hmm. Now, my point is a little different, and I'm very persuaded by your analysis, which certainly explains some things that I think a number of us have thought strange for a number of years. But my concern is the things that aren't included in those analyses, and in particular the impacts on people. And there have been a number of reports and papers out over the last year or two looking at the health impacts of flooding, and in particular the mental health impacts on a substantial number of people who are flooded, suggesting that as many as 1/3 of those flooded will show serious mental health symptoms which might disable them, for instance, in taking a part in the economic life of the country for several years afterwards, if not permanently. And we have not attempted historically to value that impact of flooding, and I think that's an area that we should treat very seriously. And I suspect that it might even turn out to be a larger economic effect than the effect on property. But whether or not it deals with the 1 billion is irrelevant. It's a missing factor that I believe we should take more seriously.
Well, I agree with that, Brian. Yeah, I agree with that. It will be a struggle to get a doubling of the current calculated AED, but you might get there. I entirely agree. And we need a more comprehensive assessment. And we need to have it properly peer-reviewed, and we need to have it properly validated if we can. And there has been some work on the health effects of flooding, and they are considerable, the mental health effects. I know Public Health England is very concerned about this. It should be more investigated. It's quite difficult to do because you need to have proper case control sampling, and that's not easy. But yes, I agree with you. There are lots of things missing here.
You quoted some Kant, or you Kanted. I'll quote a bit too. Immanuel Kant said, everything either has a price or a dignity, and anything that has a price can be replaced, and some things cannot be replaced, and therefore they don't have a price, they have dignity. I think this AAD thing is a kind of economic distortion, because getting flooded is pretty undignified, and people who live in floodplains need to get some dignity back, and we can't put a price on that. And so I think we are really missing the point if we just try and reduce it to an economic damage, because that's putting it on a par with a bank failure. Well, getting flooded is not like a bank failure. I don't mean a stream bank, by the way. I mean economic bank. Owen.
Owen Tarrant, Environment Agency. A comment and a question, I think, has been the format so far. So I think my comment is delivering a national flood risk assessment is no mean feat, and obviously largely thanks to many people in this room, we've been world leaders in delivering that national scale assessment that has actually now been emulated across China and in the US, for example. So I agree with the comments that Edmund is making and the need to critique that assessment, but I don't want to detract from the assessment itself. I think my question was the paradigm that you're promoting, Edmund, in terms of a reality-based assessment. Flood risk management inherently requires the ability to look through the future and anticipate risks and develop mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies to combat those risks. The work that you're presenting is done obviously with the benefit of hindsight, and I'm struggling to see how such an approach would allow this future anticipation of risks. So I think obviously we're definitely reliant on models to do that, but I can certainly see the value in the work that you're doing to calibrate and validate those models.
That's a really good point, Owen. I mean, okay, so that's a real challenge to my idea. Well, I suppose we have to be realistic about what our projections of the future are. And I was involved in the foresight team, and so was Colin. And I think we can now see in retrospect that our scenarios were often misinterpreted as forecasts. And that's a difficulty for science, and it's about science communication, isn't it? You can get misunderstood. And yes, of course, all flood risk management is about trying to avert future losses. So how do we get a more realistic assessment of future losses? Well, one of the things to do is to recognize that development is happening. But the Treasury rules don't allow us to account future development in the benefit cost analysis of any scheme. That's unrealistic. We know that. You know that from TE 2100. That fantastic diagram, a picture of a man standing next to a seawall and a series of slices where it had been changed every time the law changed. So the future is not the same as the current, not the same as the present, is it? We just have to be as realistic as possible. Whereas I think in foresight we were a bit gung-ho, naive young people and all that sort of thing. And we need, I think, to have... You mean not naive old people? No, we had a great time doing it. But it was that we were experimenting, and there wasn't much of a peer review process of foresight, if you actually were honest about it. It was sent out to peer review to a certain extent, but it was all rather rushed at the end, and that wasn't really very satisfactory. We wouldn't do that again. So yes, the future is uncertain. So our predictions must involve uncertainty bands. That's not built into current project appraisal. Should be.
A very small comment on the insurance question. A lot of people I've been interviewing recently, small businesses, have distinguished between what they call small floods, what they call bad floods or real floods. And when it comes to insurance, they're not bothering to claim for the small floods because they don't want their premium to go up. Or previous research in the case of householders, they don't want to be identified as household in flood risk areas. They're afraid of the stigma, they're afraid of the impact on insurance premiums and their excess. So I just wonder how realistic the ABI figures are, given that many companies, many householders aren't claiming for the smaller floods and only claiming when they think their business would actually collapse if they didn't claim.
That's Tim Harris from Kingston University. Yeah, that's another good point. How would you get at that information? Well, you do it through some sort of social survey approach, which I think you've done. Yeah, we may be missing lots of insured losses. Well, there are insured losses, but people don't claim. I would be more worried about that if the ABI insurance results were the only ones I'd used, whereas actually I've used several different approaches, coming from several different directions, which come more or less to the same result. That gives me some confidence that the estimates are more or less okay. And it gives me more confidence that the process by which the £1 billion estimate has some problems with it. Now, I'm not a hydraulic engineer, and I don't know what those problems are, but they seem to be something to do with, first of all, the flood spreading model, but other people dispute that. Secondly, I think there is a growing consensus that the fragility curves that are used within RASP, which predict the probability of failure of defences, are a little on the hard side. That is to say, failure is predicted, or hard or soft side, failure is over-predicted. And I've talked to Jim Hall about that, and he says that's a possibility. And that may be one of the causes. But I think you're right. I think we need more information. It's devil of a job getting information out of the insurance industry. If anybody's ever succeeded, I'd be really pleased to talk to them. It's all clouded with confidentiality, which is rather spurious, but never mind. But it's a fair point. Small floods are not often claimed for, and these frequent small floods might contribute quite a lot to AAD.
Let's go to the back, and then down to front, and then in the middle to Paul.
It was just a comment. I wondered whether SMEs were actually included in your calculations and the indirect costs.
Say who you are first.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I'm Lindsay McEwen, and I'm from the University of the West of England near Bristol. It was just a comment, really. I just wondered, I was reflecting a bit on Tewkesbury and the impact of the floods on Tewkesbury after the 2007 floods, and the impact on small businesses there, but not just the immediate impact, but the indirect impacts that are still being borne by those businesses as being seen as a flood town. And I just wondered if that sort of, it's an omission, I think, from the data that's been collected there at present. At least that's my understanding of what you've presented.
Yeah, you're right. The SMEs are accounted for the direct damages, but not the indirect losses. However, very few indirect losses are national economic losses because, okay, a shop doesn't sell so many bananas, but the shop down the road in Gloucester sells more bananas. And so, you know, there's a cancelling out element there. Trade is deferred or transferred, deferred in time or transferred in space. So the national economic losses from indirect losses are really quite small.
Sue Ballard, Met Office. Wasn't clear whether you'd included all the damage to infrastructure and the impact on businesses through closure of rails, railways, bridges, roads, road damage.
No, NAFRA doesn't include those either. And they can be substantial. We did some work after the 2000 event looking at the Bellwin claims, which are claims by local authorities to the national exchequer, as it were, and those are quite substantial. I'm not saying that the losses are the figures I give. The figures I give, I'm comparing like with like. And if you do that, some questions get raised. There are other losses to the nation, to individuals, which are equally important. Maybe not £1 billion. I think they're a long way away from that. And damage to roads is quite a difficult thing to assess. I live in Gloucestershire part of the time. And I noticed before the 2007 events, the roads were in pretty bad shape, especially the minor roads. And after the 2000 event, the county council got a load of money to repair these floods on the these roads on the basis of the floods in 2007. But actually, they were substantially damaged before then. Just the Belbin claim allows them to do that.
Spoken like an insurer. Paul.
Paul says, a slight hand in NAFRA. I missed your talk, Edmund. I'm sorry, so I'm picking up on the conversations that have been going on there. But I think investment planning with infinite sums is, of course, easy. There's no question if you've got an infinite sum to invest. So risk provides you a way of establishing, obviously, where the priorities might lie. So you're not just after the final number, you need a way of disaggregating in some way what is driving those numbers in certain places to guide your investment. Is it this particular channel conveyance, or is it the defence, or is it the threshold level? So you need to understand where those lie, and NAFRA starts giving you some below that number, some indication of where those investments lie. And there are a lot of uncertainties, and I think at the NAFRA scale there might be some systematic bias, so some of the errors only increase risk, some of the errors don't have an impact. So I think there might be some errors within NAFRA that does systematically increase the risk.
Okay, I don't disagree with that. I'm looking for a systematic, thorough report on the NAFRA methodology. And there isn't one. There's only a report, a skeleton report in 2006. There's no report for 2008 that I can find of any significance that allows you to do exactly what you want. I'm looking for a map of NAFRA results. So I can say, what does it say about Oxford? Or what does it say about wherever? There's no map that I can get except the recent maps on the agency website, but they don't have damage figures on them. I'm looking for transparency. I'm looking for systematic methodology statement, which I can't find. And I'm looking for something which tells me how to investigate in detail and in your way what are the contributing factors to risk. Then you have a really, really powerful tool that you can unpack a grid square or unpack a town and say, it's caused by that large factory down by the floodplain, or it's caused by that new housing estate, or that major A road that gets flooded every 3 or 4 years. That's what's really driving AED. We don't have that. If we had that, we'd be better off.
And then we're coming to the end, I think. So we've got 2 more questions in the pipe. Then we'll wrap up.
Hello, it's Stefan Leger from the Amendment Agency. Thanks, Edmund. It's a very insightful talk, very useful discussion. And obviously we've picked up on those things in previous meetings. I think what becomes clear, it is a very difficult area, assessing residual risk. And it was, there are no easy answers really, but we do value those, any challenge. But what strikes me is that sometimes those values get focused on, and maybe they get slightly over-interpreted. And the numbers are around, they're iconic, as you say, but they provide a very narrow interpretation of impacts of flooding. As Colin and others said, it doesn't capture wider impacts. It doesn't necessarily show us the effects of any interventions. And it certainly does not include the politics, which we've seen can often actually be the main driving force where money is spent and how flood risk is managed. So I think what I take away here is that those things can be improved, need improving, but are we actually looking at the right thing? And are we interpreting impacts of flooding too narrowly? And if we were to start again, what would be the right sort of measure to provide a sort of picture of what flood risk is in the country and how it might evolve in future? Because it's very easy to hone in on those numbers, but actually it's, the world is more complex, and I would be really keen on yours and other views. If we were to start again, how would we measure, or how should we provide that picture to provide a more rich picture?
Okay, I think they're absolutely right. I think we need a couple more metrics, and one of which is which areas are likely to be affected by really serious flooding. Because the annual average covers so many different circumstances. You can get an annual average which is comprised of a huge event occurs very rarely, huge event. Or you can get an annual average of the same value, which is a lot of little events that occur all the time. And we need to separate those 2 out because they have different policy implications and different intervention implications, very, very, very different interventions. So I think we need to complement with other things. And I was very interested to talk to Daniel Johns at the Adaptation Subcommittee just last week, and he had drawn out a graph of the areas which are most at risk in terms of both AAD and extreme events. And what comes out top? Hull. Where does Hull come on the NAFRA map? I don't know, actually. But it's interesting. If you look at it in a slightly different way, you get different answers. And Hull is a situation where really extreme events drive a potentially very serious event, whereas some of the AAD squares, which are bright blue, are those events like Tewkesbury, for example, where it floods very frequently. There is damage, but it's not catastrophic.
Okay. I'll go in order, and we'll give you the last word.
Thanks. I'm Tom Ball from the University of Dundee. Not quite getting the last question, but what I thought I might do is just try and broaden it out in terms of beyond the UK and perhaps look a bit to the future, particularly in terms of research. I was wondering the extent to which this may be a problem that might be more general internationally, and whether there is any knowledge of, particularly within Europe, bearing in mind that the flooding directive required all EU signatory states to it to make an assessment of vulnerability to flooding. And I know from the perspective of the Scottish jurisdiction, that was done by the use of the annual average damages from DEFRA figures in the context of potentially vulnerable areas. So that got me thinking that maybe this is an issue that faced other European countries. And I was wondering the extent to which that might have happened, and also perhaps the extent to which we might be able to learn from other countries' implementation of methods to assess vulnerability to flooding, which may or may not be done on a national level in other European countries, but perhaps there might be some international analogies that could sort of drive the agenda forward of the UK. I suppose this is relevant particularly for a lot of people in the room who might be thinking about Horizon 2020 as a means to further some funding for flood risk, bearing in mind that there is an explicit call within Horizon 2020 for research on disaster risk reduction and assessment methods there in that area. So I sort of thought it might be relevant for the future research agenda within Europe to maybe think about the extent to which this might be a general problem.
I think it's a good point. My colleague Colin Green at Flood Hazard did a paper in Nature recently about coastal cities and flooding, and I asked him how he'd worked out the existing standard of defences, and he said it was done pretty roughly, pretty crudely, which you have to do. And my hunch is that the flaw in a lot of broad-scale assessments, national assessments, regional assessments, the flaw, if there is a flaw, is in the assessing the vulnerability of existing defences. There are very few major cities in Europe that haven't got some protection against flooding. And if you say it's a 10-year standard or a 50-year standard, it makes a huge difference to assess risk. And I have a worry about that countries using the Floods Directive have gone from hazard exposure to annual damage calculations and hence managed solutions without a really good understanding, as the agency has a really good understanding of broadly the standard of protection of the existing defences. So that's, I think, something that needs to be looked at. Okay.
It's Andy Crossan from the Environment Agency. So I wanted to pick up on this point about, does this matter? Will we make different decisions around this? And one of the things you showed early on in the presentation was the National Risk Register. And I think your implication there was that the impact was being over-egged in the National Risk Register. I suspect that your analysis wouldn't affect the risk register. We would have to go away and have a look at it. But there are two reasons why I don't think it would affect it. One is that the impact bands are very broad, so 0.3 billion and 1 billion may be in the same band. But probably more likely is that the impact score doesn't only look at economics, it looks at a range of other factors associated with the risks. And one of the key ones, I think, for flooding is around disruption, social disruption, and I think flooding will score high on that, and therefore the impact score probably would be unchanged. But we need to go away and have a look at that.
Well, have a look at it. I don't know. I still think you'd have a job getting coastal flooding right up there as a second one. I really do, because of the high standard of defences we've generally got. And look, we've just had a very, very extreme event on the East Coast. Okay, there was some flooding, but most of the defences were held strong. The quality of the engineering has been high, as far as I can tell. Okay, you're having to spend 140 million repairing them. But, you know, that's actually not very much on an annual basis. If you think of the repair bills, I mean, that as one metric of potential damage. So I think that coastal flooding is over-egged. Please investigate it. Please prove me wrong. And please prove that you have a better reality check than I have.
Well, let's finish with Hazel.
Thank you, Edmund. It was really interesting. Thinking about your response to Stefan's question, in which you emphasised that the important point was spatial variability and hotspots and looking at particular questions around flood risk rather than focusing on a particular figure. I've always personally been very suspicious of the use of a single figure for anything, really. It doesn't often show very much. And I'm wondering how you would feel if government funding was reduced by 50% because it's now realised that we've been overestimating our flood. annual damages by a factor of 5 over the years. I mean, is that going to be the outcome of your findings, that there is less money around to address this because it's been over-egged?
Well, that's not for me to say, really. It's not for me to say how much money the country should spend on flood risk management. What I know is that the benefit-cost ratios for all flood defence expenditure are very, very high in comparison with other investment across Whitehall. They're 8 to 1, and I have confidence in those figures. You know, they may be up and down a bit. You know, there's always uncertainty. But the investment spend is wisely made, and I think there's probably a case for more spend rather than less. That's not the objective of my exercise. So, no, I think the agency is well supported by its project appraisal guidelines, all 350 pages of them. And as I say, I have confidence in that. It's not for me to say how much the nation should spend on flood risk management. I think probably we spend too little. I'm just trying to get one little angle on what the total risk is. And I agree, one figure is not enough. As I said, we need to have information on the hotspots and severe areas rather than just one place. But we need a more comprehensive assessment, and we need it properly science-based.
Good. I think that was a really good discussion. Just in closing, the thing that surprised me is nobody's mentioned risk to life. And I think that can be a bit of a game changer because risk to life is treated separately, and people getting killed in floods is unacceptable in the UK. So we have to do flood defences properly. And I wouldn't have quite as much faith in them, I guess, as Edmund, because I think unless they're properly maintained, unless they actually work under load when tested, then it's better not to have them at all. Because if you live behind a levee in the 9th Ward of New Orleans and the levee fails, you get killed. If you didn't have a levee and lived there, you would get flooded, which is not the same thing. So defences are great, but they do have to work. And that means, as the Select Committee said, we're going to get serious about investment in maintenance and repair, the Cinderella side of managing down flood risk. So thanks very much. I think we are ready to start the programme of 2-minute elevator presentations. And thanks very much for your interest and discussion.